The winter of 1887 descended upon Pine Ridge, Montana, with merciless intensity. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape in pristine white, transforming the frontier town into a tableau of stark beauty and unforgiving harshness. On this particular Sunday morning, the small wooden church at the edge of town stood as the only refuge from the biting cold, its bell tolling with solemn purpose across the valley. Inside, the gathered townspeople sat in hushed reverence, their breath visible in the inadequately heated sanctuary. At the front of the church, a simple pine coffin rested before the altar, adorned with nothing but a worn Bible and a single candle. The deceased Joseph Thornhill had been a man of modest means, but considerable respect in Pine Ridge, a rancher, a widower, and now the victim of murder. In the front pew sat 12-year-old Rachel Thornhill, her copper-red hair falling in neat braids over her shoulders. Her face, though young, carried a composure that spoke of a child forced to grow up too quickly. She wore her Sunday best, a navy blue dress that had once belonged to her mother, Martha, and kept her spine straight, despite the crushing weight of grief upon her narrow shoulders. Unlike the other mourners, Rachel shed no tears. Her green eyes, startlingly similar to her father's, remained dry but vigilant, as though expecting some revelation, even in this moment of finality. Joseph Thornhill was a man who understood the meaning of integrity, intoned Reverend Miller, his voice carrying through the church. A man who served his country with distinction, who raised his daughter alone after the tragic passing of his beloved Martha, and who lived by the teachings of our Lord until his final day. Rachel stared at the coffin without blinking. 3 weeks had passed since she'd found her father's body near their overturned wagon, 2 bullet holes in his chest, his blood staining the fresh snow crimson. 3 weeks of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. 3 weeks of being treated with the peculiar mixture of pity and distance that frontier towns reserved for orphans. The church door suddenly burst open with a bang that made several parishioners jump. A blast of frigid air swept through the sanctuary, carrying with it the imposing figure of Sheriff Emmett Cooper. Behind him, stumbling in chains, came a man so wild and unkempt he barely resembled a civilized being. Silas Blackwood stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, his frame lean yet powerful beneath layers of buckskin and wool. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, shot through with premature gray, despite his apparent age of perhaps 40. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, piercing blue, like chips of ice against his weathered skin, alert and assessing, even as the rest of him appeared resigned. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," Sheriff Cooper announced, yanking on Blackwood's chains. "But I thought the Thornhill girl had a right to face her father's killer before he hangs tomorrow." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Fleming, who ran the boarding house, clutched her chest in scandalized horror. Judge Theodore Grant, who had traveled from Helena for the funeral, frowned deeply at this disruption of sacred proceedings. Rachel remained motionless, her gaze now fixed on the chained man. Blackwood, feeling her scrutiny, slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. Something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but a strange acknowledgement that made the air in the church seem suddenly heavier. "Sheriff Cooper!" Judge Grant began, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is hardly appropriate during if ong din giet cha toi." Rachel interrupted, speaking Vietnamese for the first time in public, startling everyone who knew her as a quiet child who rarely spoke out of turn. "Sao, ong kong hoan ten not kong vic, va giet toi lundi." She switched to English, her voice steady and clear. "If you meant to kill my father, why not finish the job and kill me too?" The church fell silent. Even Reverend Miller seemed at a loss for words. Blackwood stared at Rachel with an intensity that might have frightened another child. But Rachel Thornhill had inherited her father's steady nerve and her mother's unflinching perception. "You look at me like you know me," she continued, taking a step toward the chained man. "You know something I don't you?" Sheriff Cooper yanked Blackwood backward. "That's enough, girl. This was a mistake. We'll leave you to your grieving." As Cooper dragged Blackwood back toward the door, the mountain man spoke for the first time, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying an unexpected gentleness. "My condolences for your father, child. He was a good man." The doors closed behind them, leaving Rachel standing alone at the front of the church, the coffin before her, and the stunned congregation behind her. Reverend Miller cleared his throat and hastily resumed the service, but Rachel barely heard him. In that brief exchange, she had glimpsed something in Blackwood's eyes that contradicted everything the town believed about her father's murder. Not guilt, not malice. Something that looked remarkably like grief. 3 days later, Pine Ridge gathered for a different kind of ceremony in the town square. A wooden platform had been erected outside the sheriff's office, ringed by curious onlookers despite the biting cold. Judge Grant stood at its center, his black coat formal against the backdrop of rough frontier buildings. "By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory," he announced, consulting a pocket watch before continuing, "I hereby commence these proceedings according to territorial statute governing the disposition of those convicted of capital crimes." Rachel stood at the edge of the crowd, a woolen shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Beside her, Dr. Samuel Owens, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, kept a protective hand near her elbow. Since Joseph's death, the doctor had acted as Rachel's temporary guardian, checking on her daily and ensuring she had food and firewood. The prisoner, Silas Blackwood, having been found guilty of the murder of Joseph Thornhill, may be sentenced to indentured servitude rather than hanging, provided a suitable master can be found. Judge Grant's voice carried across the square. "The term of service shall be no less than 7 years, and the successful bidder assumes full responsibility for the prisoner's behavior and control." Sheriff Cooper led Blackwood onto the platform. The mountain man's chains rattled in the silence, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He stood tall despite his bonds, scanning the crowd without apparent concern for his fate. "Bidding will commence at $50, Judge Grant announced. The crowd remained silent for several moments before Victor Hammond raised his hand. A cattle baron who owned the largest spread in the county, Hammond cut an imposing figure in his tailored coat and wide-brimmed hat. $50, Hammond called out. "I can always use another hand at the ranch, even one with blood on his." A few townspeople chuckled nervously. Hammond's wealth and political connections made him both respected and feared in Pine Ridge. $50 from Mr. Hammond, Judge Grant acknowledged. "Do I hear 60? 60? Called out Walter Jenkins, the blacksmith. "Strong back, like that could be useful at the forge." The bidding continued slowly, creeping up to $75 as a few more townspeople joined in. Throughout the proceedings, Blackwood remained impassive, as though the auction determining his fate were happening to someone else entirely. At $100, Hammond spoke again. $100, and that's my final offer. No one else in this town has more use for a murderer than I do." Judge Grant surveyed the crowd. $100 from Mr. Hammond. Going once, $150. The voice, clear and steady, caused every head to turn. Rachel Thornhill stepped forward, shrugging off Dr. Owens's restraining hand. "Plus, the deed to the Thornhill Ranch." A ripple of astonishment passed through the crowd. Hammond's face darkened with anger and surprise. "Girl, this isn't a game," the cattle baron snapped. "Go back to the doctor and let the men handle this." Judge Grant peered down at Rachel over his spectacles. "Miss Thornhill, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I must question both your legal standing to bid and your ability to manage a dangerous criminal." Rachel reached into her coat and withdrew a leather pouch and a folded document. "I have $150 in gold and silver saved by my father and myself." She held up the document. "And the deed to our ranch, which lists me as co-owner alongside my father." Dr. Owens stepped forward. "Your Honor, Joseph Thornhill named me as Rachel's temporary guardian in his will, with instructions to assist her in managing the ranch until she comes of age. I can verify that Rachel is indeed co-owner of the property and has the legal right to utilize those assets." Judge Grant examined the deed carefully. The Thornhill property comprises 40 acres, with water rights estimated value of $500. He looked at Rachel with newfound respect. "That would bring your bid to $650 total." Hammond scoffed. "This is absurd. You're going to let a child claim ownership of a killer." "The law makes no stipulation about age, Mr. Hammond," Judge Grant replied evenly. "Only about legal ownership of property and guardianship." He turned to Rachel. "Miss Thornhill, do you understand what you're proposing? This man was convicted of murdering your father." Rachel met the judge's gaze without wavering. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor. And may I ask why you would want to claim your father's murderer?" The crowd leaned forward collectively, eager for her answer. Rachel glanced at Blackwood, whose ice-blue eyes had narrowed slightly, the first change in his expression since the auction began. "The Bible teaches forgiveness, Your Honor," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "If this man is to work off his debt to society, I believe he should do so on my father's land, using my father's tools, learning what my father taught about honest work and Christian redemption." A murmur passed through the crowd, some impressed by her maturity, others scandalized by her decision. "Going once," Judge Grant said, his eyes still on Rachel. "Going twice." He paused, giving Hammond one last chance to counter. When the cattle baron remained silent, seething with barely contained rage, the judge's gavel fell with a crack like a gunshot. "Sold to Miss Rachel Thornhill." As the crowd dispersed, many casting backward glances at the strange tableau of a young girl claiming ownership of her father's alleged killer, Sheriff Cooper removed Blackwood's chains. "You try anything," Cooper growled, "and I'll hunt you down myself." Blackwood rubbed his raw wrists, his eyes never leaving Rachel. "I gave my word to accept the arrangement. I'll honor it." The journey back to the Thornhill Ranch passed in tense silence. Rachel drove the wagon, a small figure dwarfed by the vastness of the Montana landscape. Blackwood sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance on the narrow bench. Dr. Owens followed on horseback, having insisted on escorting them home. As they crested the final hill, the Thornhill Ranch came into view, a modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a weathered barn, and corrals for livestock. Smoke rose from the chimney. Neighbors had been keeping the fire going during Rachel's absence. Rachel pulled the wagon to a stop before the cabin. "This is it," she said simply. "Home." Blackwood surveyed the property with careful attention, noting the broken fence section, the woodpile running low, and the cattle gathered in the distant pasture. His eyes missed nothing, cataloging both the ranch's potential and its immediate needs. Dr. Owens dismounted, approaching Rachel with concern. "Are you certain about this, Rachel? You could still change your mind." Judge Grant would understand. Rachel shook her head, her decision made. She turned to Blackwood, who stood waiting for instructions. "There's a room in the barn with a cot and stove. That's where you'll sleep." Her voice carried surprising authority for one so young. "You'll take meals in the house with me, but you'll spend your nights out there." "Understood," Blackwood replied. Rachel fixed him with a steady gaze. "The door doesn't lock from the outside, Mr. Blackwood. If you want to run, nothing's stopping you except your word." Dr. Owens looked alarmed. "Rachel, that's hardly—" "But if you run," she continued, ignoring the doctor's protest, "every lawman in the territory will hunt you down. And when they catch you, and they will catch you, you'll hang. Is that also understood?" A flicker of something like respect crossed Blackwood's face. "Perfectly." Dr. Owens insisted on staying for dinner, clearly uncomfortable, leaving Rachel alone with Blackwood on their first night. He bustled about the kitchen preparing a simple meal of salt pork and beans, while Rachel showed Blackwood to his quarters in the barn. The small room was clean, but sparse. A narrow cot, a pot-bellied stove, a washstand, and a hook for clothes. A single window looked out over the ranch, offering a clear view of the main house and surrounding property. "This is where the hands stay during roundup," Rachel explained. "It's not much, but it's warm enough once the stove gets going." Blackwood set down his meager belongings, a bedroll, a battered tin cup, and a small leather pouch. "It's more than adequate." Rachel watched him carefully. "You didn't kill my father, did you?" The directness of her question seemed to catch even Blackwood off guard. He turned slowly to face her, his expression guarded. "What makes you say that?" "You didn't answer my question." Blackwood studied her for a long moment. "How would you know what's true? You've only the word of a stranger against the judgment of your town." "I've been having dreams," Rachel said quietly. "For months before Papa died. Dreams of a man watching our ranch from the ridge. A man with eyes like yours." She took a step closer, fearless despite the difference in their size. "When they brought you into the church, I recognized you. You were watching us long before Papa died, weren't you?" Blackwood's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or reluctant admiration. "You're observant for one so young." "You still haven't answered my question." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. Finally Blackwood spoke, his voice low and measured. "No, Rachel Thornhill, I did not kill your father." Rachel nodded slowly, as though this confirmation aligned with her own suspicions. "Then why didn't you defend yourself? Why accept the verdict?" "Sometimes," Blackwood said, "punishment isn't for the crimes we commit, but for those we failed to prevent." Before Rachel could press further, Dr. Owens called from the house that supper was ready. She gave Blackwood one last searching look before turning toward the door. "We'll continue this conversation another time, Mr. Blackwood. For now, there's work to be done, and I expect you to earn your keep." That night, after Dr. Owens had reluctantly departed with promises to return the next day, Rachel sat alone at her father's desk in the cabin's main room. The mountain man had retired to the barn after dinner, honoring the boundaries she'd established without complaint. She opened the worn Bible that had been her father's constant companion, finding comfort in its familiar pages and the notes scribbled in his steady hand. Joseph Thornhill had been a man of deep faith and quiet strength, reading scripture each evening by lamplight, while Rachel sat nearby, often whittling small animals from pine scraps or mending clothes. "I don't understand Papa," she whispered to the empty room. "If he didn't kill you, who did? And why is he willing to take the blame?" Outside, the Montana night settled cold and clear over the ranch, stars pricking the vast darkness like distant lanterns. In the barn, Silas Blackwood stared out his small window toward the main house, where a single lamp still burned in the window. His weathered face reflected a complex mixture of grief, resolve, and something that might have been hope, the first he'd felt in many years. The morning brought work, as mornings always did on a ranch. Rachel woke before dawn, built up the fire, and began her chores with the disciplined routine her father had instilled in her. She was milking the cow when Blackwood appeared in the barn doorway, already dressed and ready for the day's labor. "There's coffee in the house," she said without looking up. "Help yourself. Then the north fence needs mending. Tools are in the shed." If Blackwood was surprised by her businesslike manner, or her assumption of authority despite her age, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and went about the tasks assigned to him with quiet efficiency. By midday, Rachel had to admit, if only to herself, that Blackwood's presence was a blessing in practical terms. The man worked tirelessly, completing in hours repairs that would have taken her days. He split firewood, mended fences, and tended to the livestock with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to physical labor and self-sufficiency. Rachel watched him from the kitchen window as he repaired the roof of the chicken coop, his movements economical and precise. There was nothing wild or dangerous in his behavior, only the measured competence of a man who understood the rhythms of ranch life and respected them. Their interactions remained minimal throughout that first week. Rachel gave instructions. Blackwood carried them out without complaint. They shared meals in silence, each watching the other with careful consideration. Rachel found herself studying his hands, large and calloused, but capable of surprising gentleness when handling animals or delicate tools. On the seventh day, their tentative routine was interrupted by the arrival of Victor Hammond. Rachel spotted his approach from the kitchen window, a solitary rider on a gleaming black stallion, his posture radiating authority even from a distance. "Mr. Blackwood," she called toward the barn, "we have company." Blackwood emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the approaching rider. "Hammond, you know him." "I know of him." Blackwood's tone suggested this knowledge was not favorable. Hammond reined his horse to a stop before the cabin, his gaze moving dismissively over Blackwood before settling on Rachel. "Miss Thornhill," he greeted, tipping his hat. "I thought I'd check on how you're managing with your unusual arrangement." Rachel stepped onto the porch, maintaining the higher ground as her father had taught her when dealing with men who underestimated her. "We're managing just fine, Mr. Hammond. Thank you for your concern." Hammond dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I've come with a proposition for you, young lady, one that could solve all your problems." "I wasn't aware I had problems that needed solving," Rachel replied evenly. Hammond smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "A child alone on a ranch with her father's killer. I'd call that a problem." He mounted the porch steps, causing Rachel to take an involuntary step backward. "I'm prepared to offer you $500 for this property, a fair price, considering the circumstances." Behind Hammond, Blackwood had moved closer, his stance alert, but non-threatening. "The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Hammond," Rachel said firmly. "My father built this place for our family." "Your family," Hammond laughed. "Child, you have no family now, just 40 acres of land that's too much for you to manage, and a murderer you foolishly believe you can control." His voice softened to what he clearly thought was a reasonable tone. "Be sensible, Rachel. Take the money, move to town, perhaps apprentice with Mrs. Fleming at the boarding house. That's a more suitable future for a girl in your position." "My position is owner of the Thornhill Ranch," Rachel replied, her chin lifting. "And as I said, it's not for sale." Hammond's face hardened. "Your father received the same offer a week before his unfortunate accident. He also refused, though I warned him it was in his best interest to accept." The implication hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Is that a threat, Mr. Hammond?" Blackwood's voice came from just behind the cattle baron, startling him. Hammond turned, finding himself uncomfortably close to the taller man. "Just stating facts, murderer. Facts have consequences." "So do threats," Blackwood replied quietly. "Especially against children." Hammond's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, but Blackwood didn't move, didn't react, except for a slight narrowing of his ice-blue eyes. "You'd do well to remember your place," Hammond snarled. "My place is here," Blackwood replied, "working off my debt to society under Miss Thornhill's supervision, as legally established by Judge Grant." Hammond looked between them, seeming to realize he'd overplayed his hand. With forced casualness, he stepped back and adjusted his hat. "My offer stands for 1 week, Rachel. After that, I can't guarantee the same generosity." He untied his horse and mounted in one fluid motion. Things happen to isolated ranches. Accidents, fires, raids by desperate men. It would be a shame if you faced such troubles alone. They watched in silence as Hammond rode away, his straight back radiating indignation. "He wanted our ranch before Papa died," Rachel said quietly. "Why, Pulse?" Blackwood shook his head. "Men like Hammond collect land like some collect coins. It's about power, not need." "He seemed to know you." "Men like Hammond make it their business to know everyone who might be useful or dangerous to them." Blackwood turned to Rachel, his expression serious. "Bar your door tonight. I'll keep watch from the barn." That evening, a blizzard swept down from the mountains with unexpected ferocity. Snow, driven by howling winds, reduced visibility to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted to a bone-aching cold. Rachel had just finished securing the kitchen shutters when a particularly violent gust extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. She fumbled for matches, her fingers stiff with cold, when a knock came at the door. Cautious, remembering Hammond's veiled threats, she called out, "Who is it?" "Blackwood. The barn roof is compromised. Snow's coming in." Rachel hesitated only briefly before unbarring the door. Blackwood entered in a swirl of snow and frigid air, carrying his bedroll and a lantern that cast eerie shadows across the cabin's interior. "Half the roof collapsed under the snow," he explained, stomping his boots on the threshold. "Too dangerous to stay there tonight." Rachel nodded, practical considerations overriding any awkwardness. "You can sleep by the fire. I'll get blankets." As the storm raged outside, they established an uneasy truce in the cabin's main room. Rachel settled into her father's rocking chair with her quilt, while Blackwood arranged his bedroll near the hearth, maintaining a respectful distance. The howling wind and creaking timbers made conversation impossible for a time, but as the worst of the storm passed and the cabin settled into the muffled silence that comes with heavy snowfall, Rachel found herself studying Blackwood's profile in the firelight. "You were a soldier," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Blackwood glanced up from where he sat cross-legged on his bedroll, whittling a piece of pine with a small knife. "What makes you say that? The way you stand, the way you assess situations, the scar on your left arm that looks like a bullet wound." Rachel pulled her quilt closer. "Papa was a soldier too. He didn't talk about it much." Blackwood returned to his, whittling the knife, making soft scraping sounds against the wood. "The war leaves marks that don't show on the outside." "You knew him, didn't you, before?" Rachel watched his hands, the careful precision of each cut. "That's why you were watching our ranch." The knife paused momentarily, then resumed its work. "I knew a Joseph once. Whether he was your father, I couldn't say." "Did you have a family, Mr. Blackwood?" Rachel asked, changing tack. Before you came to the mountains, Blackwood was quiet for so long that Rachel thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried a weight of memory that made him seem suddenly older. I had a sister, beautiful girl, kind heart, and a friend who was like a brother to me. His knife continued its patient work, shaving away tiny curls of wood. We served together during the war. Do you miss them? Blackwood looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Every day. He set down his knife, examining the small figure taking shape in his hands, a horse, Rachel realized, with delicate legs and flowing mane. But sometimes love isn't enough to keep people together. Rachel thought of her mother, whom she knew only through her father's stories, and a single faded daguerreotype. Papa said Mama died having me, that she wanted me so badly she was willing to risk everything. Some would say that's the purest form of love, Blackwood offered quietly. Sacrifice without reservation. Rachel hesitated, then shared something she'd told no one else. I've been having dreams about the night Papa died. I see a man watching from the ridge. He rides down when he hears the shots, but he's too late. She hugged her knees to her chest. I think that man was you. Blackwood turned away, but not before Rachel caught a flicker of emotion cross his weathered features. He tossed another log on the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Dreams are strange things, he said finally. They mix truth and imagination in ways we can't always untangle. Were you there that night? Blackwood met her gaze again, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Yes, but not in time to save him. Something shifted between them in that moment, not trust exactly, but a recognition of shared truth, however partial. Rachel felt a strange relief at this confirmation, as though a burden she'd been carrying alone had been acknowledged by another. You should sleep, Blackwood said, returning to his whittling. Tomorrow will bring work, storm or no storm. Rachel nodded, curling deeper into the rocking chair. As she drifted toward sleep, lulled by the crackling fire and the soft scrape of Blackwood's knife against wood, she realized she felt safe for the first time since her father's death. Dr. Owens arrived the morning after the storm, his sleigh cutting a path through the fresh snow. He brought supplies from town, and news the blizzard had stranded several travelers, and Sheriff Cooper was organizing search parties for those still missing. The doctor eyed Blackwood with suspicion when he found him chopping wood near the house rather than in the barn, but Rachel quickly explained about the collapsed roof. Owens seemed unconvinced, but held his peace, instead focusing on examining Rachel for any signs of illness or distress. You seem well enough, considering, he pronounced, packing away his stethoscope. Though I wish you'd reconsider this arrangement. Mrs. Fleming has a spare room at the boarding house. You'd be safer in town. This is my home, Doctor, Rachel replied firmly. Papa would want me to keep it running. Owens sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw, so like Joseph's. Very well, but I have something for you. Something your father entrusted to me before he hesitated, glancing toward the window where Blackwood could be seen stacking firewood. Before his passing. From his medical bag, Owens withdrew a small wooden box, polished to a warm glow by years of handling. Joseph asked me to give you this if anything happened to him. Said it was important you have it. Rachel accepted the box with reverence, recognizing her father's craftsmanship in its dovetailed corners and the small flourish carved into its lid, a thornhill rose, the namesake of their family and ranch. There's also this, Owens added, producing a small silver key. Though what it opens I couldn't say. Joseph was very private about certain matters. As Rachel examined the key, Blackwood entered stamping snow from his boots. He froze at the sight of the wooden box in Rachel's hands, his eyes widening slightly before he composed himself. "Dr. Owens," he acknowledged with a nod. "Storm's letting up. Roads should be clear by midday." Owens eyed him warily. "Indeed. I was just delivering something to Rachel from her father." He turned back to her. "Your mother wanted that horse to be given to you on your 16th birthday, but your father thought you might need it now." "Horse?" Rachel asked, confused. "Open the box, child." With trembling fingers, Rachel lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, lay an exquisitely carved wooden horse. Every detail was rendered with loving precision: the flowing mane, the powerful muscles beneath the surface, the alert ears and intelligent eyes. It was small enough to fit in her palm, but crafted with such skill it seemed ready to gallop away at any moment. "Papa made this," she whispered carefully, lifting the figurine. "During the week before you were born," Owens confirmed. "Martha saw him working on it and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen." Blackwood had moved closer, his eyes fixed on the wooden horse with an intensity that caught Rachel's attention. "You recognize this work?" she said, not a question but a statement of fact. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. "The carving style, the attention to detail. I've seen it before." Dr. Owens straightened, suddenly alert. "You knew Joseph Thornhill before the night he died?" "I knew a man who carved horses and quoted scripture," Blackwood replied carefully. "Whether that man was Rachel's father remains to be seen." Rachel looked between the two men, sensing currents of knowledge and suspicion flowing beneath the surface of their words. She closed her fingers around the wooden horse, feeling its smooth contours press against her palm. "Thank you for bringing these, Dr. Owens," she said quietly. "I'd like some time alone now, if you don't mind." The doctor looked as though he might object, but something in Rachel's expression stopped him. "Of course. I'll return tomorrow to check on you." He gathered his things, pausing at the door to give Blackwood a warning glance. "Remember, Cooper makes his rounds every other day." After Owens departed, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, the wooden horse before her, the silver key gleaming beside it. Blackwood remained by the window, watching the doctor's sleigh disappear down the snow-covered lane. "This key opens something important, doesn't it?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Blackwood turned to face her. "That's not for me to say." "But you know." Rachel picked up the key, examining its intricate teeth. "Just like you know who carved this horse. Just like you know what really happened to my father." She fixed him with a penetrating stare. "How long are you going to pretend you're a stranger to this family, Mr. Blackwood?" Before he could answer, Rachel rose abruptly and went to her father's bedroom. She returned moments later with a loose floorboard, dusty from being recently pried up. "I found this hidden under Papa's bed," she said, setting it on the table. "There's a space underneath, but it's empty. Something was kept there, something important enough to hide." She held up the silver key. "Something this might open." Blackwood's expression remained carefully neutral, but Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening around his eyes. "If you want my trust," she said, "start by telling me the truth. Who are you to my family?" The question hung between them, charged with implications neither had fully voiced. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light through the cabin windows and illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air, silent witnesses to secrets long buried and now perhaps about to be unearthed. The winter sun cast long shadows across the Thornhill ranch as Rachel waited for Blackwood's answer. Snow glittered like scattered diamonds on the landscape outside the cabin windows, but inside the atmosphere had grown heavy with unspoken truths. Blackwood moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire, with deliberate movements that suggested he was buying time to consider his response. When he finally turned to face Rachel, his weathered features had softened slightly, the hard lines around his mouth relaxing into something almost vulnerable. "That wooden horse," he said, nodding toward the figurine still clutched in Rachel's hand, "was carved by the same technique used by a soldier I knew during the war. A man who could make beauty from scraps of wood, even in the midst of hell." Rachel placed the horse gently on the table. "Was that man my father?" Blackwood's gaze shifted to the window, focusing on the distant mountains, as though seeking strength from their implacable presence. "Before I answer that, I need to know what you're searching for, Rachel. The truth isn't always kind, and once spoken, it can't be taken back." "I'm searching for who killed my father," Rachel replied without hesitation. "And why you're willing to hang for a crime you didn't commit." A humorless smile briefly crossed Blackwood's face. "Direct like your father." He sighed, then gestured toward the hidden compartment Rachel had discovered. "You're right about that space. It held something important, something dangerous enough that Joseph felt the need to conceal it." Rachel leaned forward. "What was it?" "Documents. Records from the war." Blackwood's voice grew quieter. "Evidence of things powerful men would prefer stayed buried. And this key—" Rachel held up the silver key Dr. Owens had delivered. "That opens a lockbox Joseph kept in town at the bank. Or at least, that's where he kept it 13 years ago." Blackwood's gaze returned to Rachel, studying her reaction. "The last time I saw him." Rachel's breath caught. 13 years? That's my whole life." "Yes." The implication hung in the air between them, undeniable in its significance. Rachel's mind raced, connecting fragments of information like pieces of a complex puzzle. "You knew my parents before I was born." Blackwood nodded slowly. "That photograph I found under Papa's floorboard," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The wedding photo with the corners burnt off. You were in it, weren't you, standing beside them?" The change in Blackwood's expression, a flash of surprise, quickly masked, confirmed her suspicion before he could respond. Rachel rose from her chair and crossed to her father's bedroom, returning moments later with a damaged photograph protected between two pieces of cardboard. She placed it on the table between them. The photograph showed a younger Joseph Thornhill in a Union Army uniform, his arm around a beautiful woman with copper-red hair, clearly Rachel's mother, Martha. The right edge of the photograph had been burned, but part of a third figure remained visible enough to see a military uniform and the edge of a face with piercing eyes. "This is yours," Rachel said, pointing to the partial figure. Blackwood stared at the photograph, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: grief, nostalgia, regret, and something deeper that Rachel couldn't name. He reached out as if to touch the image, then pulled his hand back. "Yes," he admitted finally. "That's me." "Who are you really?" Rachel demanded, her voice stronger now that confirmation of her suspicions had emboldened her. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Blackwood took a deep breath as though preparing to lift a great weight. "My name isn't Blackwood. It's Silas Sullivan." He met Rachel's gaze directly. "Martha, your mother, was my sister. My adopted sister." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. "My uncle." "Yes." The revelation struck Rachel with physical force. She sank back into her chair, staring at the man she'd purchased at auction. The man who had been convicted of killing her father, now revealed as her own flesh and blood. Or at least family by bond, if not by blood. "Martha came to live with my family when she was 8 years old. Silas continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as though reciting a story he'd told himself many times. Her parents died in a cholera outbreak. My mother and father raised her as their own daughter, and I grew up thinking of her as my sister. If you were family, why weren't you in our lives? Rachel's voice trembled slightly. Why didn't Papa ever mention you? Pain flashed across Silas's face. Because I left. After their wedding, I said things, unforgivable things. I walked away from them and never looked back. The confession seemed to deflate him, his broad shoulders sagging under an invisible burden. Until it was too late. Rachel struggled to process this revelation, her mind filled with questions that tumbled over each other. You loved her too, didn't you, Mama? Silas's eyes widened with surprise at her perception. I can see it in your face when you look at her picture, Rachel explained. It's the same way Papa used to look at it. Silas nodded slowly. Yes, I loved her. He gave a bitter laugh. I was 25. Joseph and I had just returned from the war, and suddenly I saw Martha not as the little sister I'd grown up with, but as a beautiful young woman. It was unexpected. And you were jealous of Papa. I was young and foolish, Silas acknowledged. When Joseph told me he intended to propose to her, I asked him to step aside, to give me a chance. He shook his head at the memory. We'd been like brothers, saved each other's lives more than once during the fighting. I thought that meant he owed me something, even Martha's happiness. What happened? Joseph suggested we both court her properly and let her decide. Silas stared into the fire, lost in the past. She chose him, of course. They were perfect together, both gentle souls with strong convictions. But I couldn't accept it. His voice dropped lower. The night after their wedding, I confronted them both, said terrible things, accused Joseph of betraying me, questioned Martha's judgment. I was cruel in ways I've regretted every day since. Rachel could picture it, a younger version of the man before her, consumed by jealousy and wounded pride, lashing out at the two people he loved most in the world. So you left? I left Denver that same night, told them I never wanted to see either of them again. Silas's voice cracked slightly. Those were the last words I spoke to Martha. 6 months later, she died, giving birth to you. The weight of that revelation settled over the cabin. Rachel felt tears threatening but held them back, unwilling to break the moment of truth with emotion. And you didn't come back, not even then. Pride, Silas said, the word heavy with self-recrimination. The most destructive sin. By then, I'd built a wall of anger around myself so high I couldn't climb over it even for my sister's funeral. He looked up at Rachel, his ice-blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I wandered for years, working odd jobs, moving from territory to territory. Eventually, I took to the mountains, lived off the land, tried to forget. But you didn't forget, Rachel observed quietly. No, the guilt only grew stronger with time. Silas ran a hand over his beard, a gesture that seemed to belong to the younger man he'd once been. About 6 months ago, I heard talk in a trading post about a rancher named Thornhill near Pine Ridge. I thought it might be coincidence, but I had to know. So you came to watch us, Rachel said, understanding dawning. From the ridgeline. That's what I saw in my dreams. Silas nodded. I watched Joseph teaching you to ride, to mend fences, to care for the cattle. I saw how he'd built a life for you both, how he'd kept his promises to Martha, while I broke every one of mine. Something like shame crossed his face. I was working up the courage to approach him, to ask forgiveness when he was killed, Rachel finished. She studied Silas's face, searching for deception, but finding only grief and regret. You found him dying, didn't you? That's why your clothes had blood on them. I heard the shots, Silas confirmed. By the time I reached the wagon, the attackers were gone. Joseph was still alive, but barely. His voice grew rough with emotion. He recognized me. After 13 years, he knew me instantly. What did he say? Silas closed his eyes briefly, as though the memory caused physical pain. He said, "Take care of her, Silas. Promise me." His eyes opened, fixing on Rachel with fierce intensity. That was the last thing he said before he died in my arms. Rachel felt tears tracking down her cheeks now, unable to hold them back any longer. "And you promised him." "I did." Silas's hands clenched into fists on the table. "But before I could find you, Sheriff Cooper and his men arrived. They found me with Joseph's body blood on my clothes and drew their own conclusions. I didn't resist." "But why?" Rachel demanded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Why let them think you killed him when you didn't? Why not tell them the truth? Because the truth wouldn't have helped Joseph, and it might have put you in more danger." Silas leaned forward. "Think, Rachel. If I didn't kill your father, who did, and why? Better for everyone to believe justice had been served with my capture than to start asking dangerous questions." "But you would have hanged." A sad smile touched Silas's lips. "Perhaps that would have been fair punishment for abandoning my family when they needed me most." Rachel sat back, overwhelmed by these revelations. The man before her, her uncle, had been willing to die rather than risk placing her in danger, had been prepared to accept punishment for one sin by taking responsibility for another he hadn't committed. "No," she said finally, her voice steadier. "It wouldn't have been fair. And it wouldn't have been what Papa wanted." She gestured to the photograph. "He kept this all these years, even with your image partially burned away. He never truly let you go." Silas stared at the photograph as though seeing it properly for the first time. "Joseph was a better man than most. Better than me, certainly." Rachel picked up the wooden horse, running her fingers over its smooth contours. "Dr. Owen said Mama wanted me to have this when I turned 16. She looked up at Silas. "She must have known how much I would need something to connect me to both of you." The cabin fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts, as the implications of these revelations settled between them. Outside, the winter day was waning, shadows lengthening across the snow-covered yard. "The lockbox," Rachel said, suddenly remembering the silver key that had prompted this conversation. "If this opens something Papa thought important enough to hide, we need to find it." Silas's expression grew troubled. "It might be dangerous, Rachel. If Joseph was killed for what he knew, then I need to know what that was," she interrupted firmly. "I need to understand why my father died." She fixed him with a determined gaze. "You promised to protect me. That doesn't mean keeping me ignorant." A reluctant smile touched Silas's lips. "You have your mother's stubbornness." "And my father's sense of justice," Rachel countered. "We'll go to town tomorrow to the bank, together." That night, Rachel stood before her parents' graves in the small family cemetery on the hilltop behind the ranch house. The moon cast blue shadows across the snow, turning the two wooden crosses into stark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. She'd come seeking guidance, some sense of connection to the parents she'd lost, one she'd never known, the other taken before his time. The revelations of the day had transformed her understanding of her family's history, leaving her with questions that only the dead could fully answer. "I don't know what to do, Papa," she whispered to the silent crosses. "Uncle Silas is back, but I'm still angry that you never told me about him, that you kept secrets from me." Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. I understand you were protecting me, but I feel like I never really knew you." She knelt in the snow, heedless of the cold seeping through her woolen skirt. "And Mama, I wish I'd known you. I wish I could ask you what it was like to have two men love you so much they nearly destroyed each other over it." From a distance, Rachel sensed rather than saw movement. Turning, she spotted Silas standing at the edge of the cemetery, respectfully keeping his distance, but clearly maintaining watch over her. The moonlight silvered his hair and beard, making him appear ghost-like against the darkness. As she watched, Silas removed his hat and slowly knelt in the snow, his head bowed in what could only be prayer. The gesture, so unexpected from this hardened mountain man, touched something in Rachel's heart. Here was another soul grieving another person who had loved and lost Joseph and Martha Thornhill. Whatever his past sins, Silas Sullivan was suffering a pain not unlike her own. The realization didn't erase her conflicted feelings toward him, but it helped her see him more clearly, not just as her father's alleged killer, or even as her long-lost uncle, but as a flawed, broken man seeking redemption. Rachel rose from her knees, brushing snow from her skirt. As she approached Silas, he remained in his kneeling position, eyes closed, lips moving silently in words she couldn't hear. "It's getting late," she said quietly. "We should head back to the house." Silas opened his eyes, seeming momentarily disoriented, as though he'd been far away in his thoughts. He rose stiffly, replacing his hat. "I didn't mean to disturb your privacy." "You didn't." Rachel hesitated, then added, "They were your family too." Something shifted in Silas's expression, a softening around the eyes, a release of tension he'd been carrying. He nodded, unable to speak, past the emotion tightening his throat. They walked back to the ranch house in silence, their footprints leaving parallel tracks in the moonlit snow for the first time since her father's death. Rachel felt a tentative sense of connection, of not being entirely alone in the world. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. The Pine Ridge Bank occupied a brick building on the town's main street, its solid construction and iron bars a testament to the frontier's tenuous relationship with law and order. Rachel and Silas arrived shortly after it opened, drawing curious and disapproving glances from the few townspeople braving the cold morning. Inside, the bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Whitaker, nearly dropped his spectacles at the sight of Rachel, accompanied by the man convicted of murdering her father. "Miss Thornhill," he stammered, "this is most unusual." Rachel produced the silver key. "I need access to my father's safety deposit box." Whitaker's eyes darted between Rachel and Silas. That is, perhaps Sheriff Cooper should—" "Mr. Blackwood is legally in my custody," Rachel interrupted firmly. "Judge Grant confirmed this arrangement. Now, will you honor my request, or shall I speak with Judge Grant about the bank's refusal to allow me access to my family's property?" Whitaker swallowed hard. "Of course, Miss Thornhill. Right this way." He led them to a small private room at the rear of the bank, returning moments later with a metal box secured with a lock that matched Rachel's key. After Whitaker withdrew, closing the door behind him, Rachel inserted the key with trembling fingers. The lock turned with a soft click, and she lifted the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, several folded documents, and a faded photograph of a military unit, perhaps 20 men in Union uniforms standing before a war-damaged building. Rachel recognized her father immediately, his youthful face serious beneath his cap. Beside him stood a younger Silas, still beardless, but with the same penetrating eyes. "The 104th Regiment," Silas said softly, staring at the photograph. "Taken after Shiloh." Rachel opened the journal, finding pages filled with her father's neat, precise handwriting. Dates, locations, detailed accounts of military operations and casualties. She skimmed through, trying to understand the significance of these records. "These are Papa's war journals," she said. "But why were they important enough to hide, important enough to die for?" "Because they contain the truth," Silas replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper despite the privacy of their location. "About what happened at Whitlow Creek." "What's Whitlow Creek?" Silas closed his eyes briefly, as though the memory pained him physically. "A civilian settlement in Tennessee, March 1863. Rachel flipped through the journal until she found the entry for that date. As she read, her face paled. "This says, this can't be right." She looked up at Silas, horror dawning in her expression. "Papa wrote that Union soldiers executed civilians, women and children, on orders from Colonel Thaddeus Hammond." "Thaddeus Hammond," Silas repeated grimly. "Victor Hammond's father, now Senator Hammond of Montana Territory." Rachel's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. "Victor Hammond has been trying to buy our ranch. He said Papa refused him just before he died." "Because Joseph knew what Hammond's father had done," Silas confirmed. "And he had proof, not just his word against a decorated officer, but documentation, witness accounts, evidence that could destroy the senator's reputation and political career even now, all these years later." Rachel continued reading, her horror growing with each paragraph. "They claimed the settlement was harboring Confederate soldiers, but Papa writes there was no evidence. That the real reason was to cover up the theft of military supplies by Hammond and his officers." She looked up at Silas. "You were there too, weren't you?" Silas nodded, his face grim. "Joseph and I were part of the detachment sent to secure the settlement. When we realized what was happening, what Hammond intended, we tried to stop it." His hands clenched into fists. "We were too late for most of them." "Papa writes that you helped hide some of the children," Rachel said softly, reading from the journal. "That you and he smuggled 3 children out before the fires were set." "We did what little we could," Silas replied, his voice rough with old grief. "Afterward, Joseph insisted on documenting everything. Names, dates, orders given. He collected statements from other soldiers who'd witnessed the atrocity but were too afraid to speak out officially. And Hammond knew Papa kept these records. Hammond suspected many of us might have evidence against him. Over the years, several men from our unit died under mysterious circumstances." Silas's eyes met Rachel's. 3 weeks before Joseph was killed, a man named Malcolm Reynolds was seen in Pine Ridge asking questions about your father. Rachel closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. "Malcolm Reynolds, a collection agent is what he calls himself. In reality, he's a killer for hire, specializing in making problems disappear for wealthy clients." Silas leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "Joseph must have refused to surrender his records, so Hammond, father or son, sent Reynolds to ensure his silence permanently." "Then Papa died because he was honest," Rachel said, a mixture of pride and grief in her voice, "because he wouldn't let these crimes stay buried." "Joseph always believed that truth would eventually prevail," Silas agreed, "even against powerful men." Rachel gathered the documents, carefully returning them to the box. "We need to take these to Judge Grant. He'll know what to do with them." Silas's expression grew troubled. "Be careful who you trust, Rachel. Hammond's influence reaches far in this territory. We don't know who might be compromised." As they left the bank, neither noticed the man watching from across the street. A well-dressed stranger with cold eyes, who, after observing their departure, entered the telegraph office with purposeful strides. Over the next few days, Rachel found herself studying the contents of her father's lockbox with growing unease. The more she read, the more she understood the dangerous knowledge her father had carried all these years, and why powerful men would want it destroyed. Silas had taken to patrolling the ranch perimeter each evening, his military training evident in the systematic way he checked vulnerable approaches and secured the property. He spoke little of what he'd seen at Whitlow Creek, but Rachel could tell the memories haunted him, especially at night when the ghosts of the past seemed to press most closely. They established an uneasy routine. During the day they worked side by side, maintaining the ranch, Silas teaching Rachel skills her father hadn't yet passed on, Rachel showing unexpected aptitude for everything from mending tack to calculating feed requirements. In the evenings they would review Joseph's journals by lamplight, piecing together the full story of what had happened both during the war and in the years that followed. Hammond tracked down most of the witnesses, Silas explained one night, tracing names in Joseph's journal. Andrews died in a bar fight in '68. Wilcox's house burned down with him inside in '70. Peterson disappeared crossing the Mississippi in '71. "And you?" Rachel asked. "Did they come after you?" "They tried once. 2 men caught up to me in Colorado about 10 years ago." Silas's expression darkened at the memory. "They didn't return to whoever sent them." "Is that when you went to the mountains?" "Partly. I figured a moving target was harder to hit, and the high country offered plenty of places to disappear." Silas closed the journal gently. "But mostly I ran because I was a coward, too afraid to face Joseph and what I'd done to our friendship, too ashamed to learn what had become of Martha." Rachel considered this admission. "You came back, though, finally." "Too late," Silas said, regret heavy in his voice. "Not too late for me," Rachel replied quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of the fragile connection that had begun to form a damaged bridge being slowly, carefully rebuilt between islands of loss. Their third week at the ranch brought an unexpected discovery. Rachel had been cleaning her father's old hunting rifle when she noticed something odd about the stock. A small section seemed to have been hollowed out and resealed. Using her pocket knife, she carefully pried open the concealed compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper containing a hand-drawn map. Locations were marked with cryptic initials and numbers that meant nothing to her, but at the bottom, in her father's handwriting, was a message: "If you're reading this, I've failed to protect what matters most. Trust only family." Rachel showed the map to Silas that evening. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These are caches," he said finally, "places where Joseph hid copies of his evidence. He was always methodical about keeping duplicates, especially of important documents." "Why wouldn't he tell me about them?" "To protect you," Silas replied. "What you don't know, you can't reveal even under duress." The implication sent a chill through Rachel. "You think I would have been in danger if Papa had told me?" "I know you would have been." Silas pointed to one of the marked locations on the map. "This is less than a mile from here, in the old mining shaft on the North Ridge." Rachel recognized the location, a played-out silver mine that had been abandoned years before her father purchased the ranch. "We should retrieve whatever Papa hid there." "Tomorrow," Silas agreed. "It's too dangerous to go out tonight." That evening, as Rachel prepared for bed, she became aware of a sound she hadn't heard since her father's death. Silas was softly singing an old hymn as he worked on repairing her father's saddle by the fire. The familiar melody, "Amazing Grace," had been one of Joseph's favorites, often sung as he worked around the ranch. The simple domesticity of the moment brought unexpected tears to Rachel's eyes. For just an instant, it felt like family again, broken and incomplete. but family nonetheless. She fell asleep to the gentle sound of her uncle's voice carrying the age-old tune about redemption and homecoming. She woke to the sound of breaking glass. Instantly alert, Rachel slipped from her bed and reached for the shotgun her father had taught her to use. The cabin was dark, the fire having died down to embers, but she could make out Silas's silhouette as he moved silently toward the window. "Someone's outside," he whispered. "At least 2 men, maybe more." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady on the shotgun. "Hammond's men, likely." Silas peered cautiously through the window. "They're surrounding the house. Professional approach, military precision." A voice called from outside, casual and conversational despite the late hour. "Quite cold out here, folks. Perhaps we could continue this discussion inside where it's warmer." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Reynolds," he murmured. "The man who killed Papa." Rachel whispered, anger flaring hot in her chest. "Listen carefully," Silas said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a space under the floorboards in the pantry, your father's emergency hiding place. Take the journals and map and get in there. Don't come out no matter what you hear. I'm not hiding while you—" "Rachel!" Silas gripped her shoulder, his eyes intense in the dim light. "I promised your father I'd protect you. Let me keep that promise." Before she could protest further, another window shattered, followed by the thud of something heavy landing on the cabin floor. Smoke began billowing from what Rachel recognized as a military smoke grenade. "Go," Silas urged, pushing her toward the pantry. "Now?" Rachel hesitated only a moment before grabbing her father's journal and the map from the table. As Silas moved to confront the intruders, she slipped into the pantry and located the loose floorboard he'd mentioned. The space beneath was narrow but adequate, a last-resort hiding place designed for precisely this kind of emergency. As she pulled the board back into place above her, the cabin door splintered inward. Through gaps in the floorboards, Rachel could see booted feet entering the main room. The smoke had grown thick, but she could still make out 4 pairs of boots, and then a 5th, these more polished than the others. "Mr. Sullivan," came the cultured voice she'd heard earlier. "Or do you prefer Blackwood these days? It's been some time since Denver." "Reynolds," Silas's voice replied, rough with smoke but steady. "Still doing Hammond's dirty work, I see." A chuckle, cold and professional. "I prefer to think of it as problem-solving for discerning clients. Speaking of problems, where is the Thornhill girl? My associates and I would prefer to have this conversation with all relevant parties present." "Gone," Silas replied. "Sent her to town yesterday, to stay with the doctor." Now that, Reynolds said, is disappointingly unlikely to be true. "Search the house," he ordered his men. "Thoroughly." Rachel held her breath as heavy footsteps moved through the cabin. She clutched the journal to her chest, pressing herself as flat as possible in the cramped space. A pair of boots stopped directly above her hiding place, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she'd been discovered. Then the boots moved on. "Clear," reported one of the men. "Interesting," Reynolds mused. "Perhaps you're telling the truth after all, Sullivan. No matter. The girl isn't our primary concern tonight." "What do you want, Reynolds?" "The same thing I wanted from Joseph Thornhill 3 weeks ago. The same thing my client has wanted for over 20 years. Reynolds's voice hardened. "Documents, records, evidence, whatever you want to call Joseph's little collection of war memorabilia." "I don't know what you're talking about." A sharp sound, the unmistakable crack of a fist connecting with flesh, followed by a grunt of pain that Rachel recognized as Silas's. "Please." Reynolds sighed. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence." Joseph Thornhill kept detailed records of the Whitlow Creek incident, records that could be most Inconvenient for certain distinguished gentlemen who've built admirable careers since those regrettable war years. If such records existed, Silas replied, his voice strained but defiant. What makes you think I'd have them? Because you're here in his home. Because the girl clearly trusts you enough to leave you alone in the house. And because you and Joseph were once as close as brothers before your little disagreement over Martha. Rachel stifled a gasp at Reynolds's knowledge of their family history. The bank manager was most helpful in describing your visit to Joseph's safety deposit box, Reynolds continued conversationally. So we know you've found something. The only question is where you've hidden it. Another blow landed, followed by the sound of furniture being overturned. We can do this the hard way, if you prefer, Reynolds said. Though I should warn you, my associates are not known for their gentle touch when it comes to extracting information. Through the cracks in the floorboard, Rachel could see Silas now forced to his knees, blood trickling from a split lip, but his eyes still defiant. You killed Joseph, Silas said flatly. A good man, an honest man. A stubborn man, Reynolds corrected, who refused a generous offer for his silence. Don't make the same mistake, Sullivan. Go to hell, Reynolds sighed theatrically. Very well, the hard way it is. What followed made Rachel bite her hand to keep from crying out. The sounds of systematic violence of her uncle being beaten by professionals who knew exactly how to cause pain without rendering their victim unconscious filled the cabin. Yet, through it all, Silas remained silent except for involuntary grunts of pain. Enough, Reynolds said finally. We're wasting time. Burn it down. Sir. One of the men sounded uncertain. The whole place. Everything. If the girl returns, tell her it was an unfortunate accident. If not, Reynolds's voice turned colder. Well, accidents claim orphans every day in these territories. Rachel heard the sounds of oil being splashed around the cabin lamp oil. She realized with horror, followed by the distinctive scratch of a match being struck. A shame, really, Reynolds remarked almost casually. It's a decent little ranch, but my client was quite clear about leaving no loose ends. Flames leapt up, visible through the cracks in the floorboards. Smoke began to seep into Rachel's hiding place, making her eyes water and her throat burn. What about him? One of the men asked, presumably gesturing toward Silas. Leave him, Reynolds ordered. The fire will take care of everything. A tragic end to the man who murdered Joseph Thornhill. Footsteps retreated, and Rachel heard the cabin door close. Through gaps in the floorboards, she could see the flames spreading rapidly across the dry wooden floor. The heat intensified, and smoke filled her hiding place, making each breath increasingly painful. She had seconds to decide remain hidden and likely die of smoke inhalation, or reveal herself and try to save both Silas and herself from the rapidly spreading fire. No choice at all, really. Rachel pushed against the floorboard and emerged into a cabin transformed into a vision of hell. Flames licked up the walls, consuming the furniture and curtains with hungry intensity. Silas lay on the floor, where Reynolds's men had left him bloodied and barely conscious. "Uncle Silas!" Rachel cried, rushing to his side. She shook him desperately. "We have to go. Now." Silas's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. "Rachel," he mumbled through swollen lips. "Hide. The cabin's on fire," she explained urgently, tugging at his arm. "We need to get out." Understanding penetrated his dazed state. With Rachel's help, Silas staggered to his feet. Together, they made their way toward the door, coughing and stumbling through the thickening smoke. The heat was intense, blistering their skin and making each breath an agony. They burst through the door into the blessed coldness of the winter night, gulping clean air into their burning lungs. Behind them, the cabin, Rachel's home. Her father's legacy was fully engulfed flames shooting skyward in a terrible, beautiful display of destructive power. "Keep moving," Silas urged, pushing Rachel toward the barn despite his injuries. "They might still be watching." Rachel glanced back at the burning cabin, grief and rage warring within her. "All of Papa's things. Your father's legacy isn't things," Silas said firmly despite his labored breathing. "It's truth, and you saved that." He nodded toward the journal still clutched in her hand. They reached the barn where the horses were whinnying in distress at the nearby fire. Silas leaned heavily against the wall, his injuries clearly taking their toll. "We need to get to town," Rachel said, assessing his condition with growing concern. "You need a doctor." Silas shook his head. "Too dangerous. Reynolds will have men watching the roads." He grimaced in pain. "We need the evidence from the mine. It's our only leverage now." "You can barely stand." "I've endured worse." Silas straightened with visible effort. "Saddle the horses. We'll go to the mine, collect Joseph's evidence, and then find somewhere safe to regroup." As Rachel prepared the horses, she couldn't help but glance repeatedly at the burning cabin. Everything she'd known, her childhood home, her father's possessions, the tangible reminders of her parents' existence, was being reduced to ash before her eyes. Yet strangely, she felt a kind of clarity emerging from the destruction. The fire had burned away hesitation and doubt, leaving only resolve. Reynolds had killed her father, had tried to kill her uncle, had intended to kill her as well, erasing the Thornhill family as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase the truth about Whitlow Creek. But they had survived, and as long as they lived, the truth Joseph Thornhill had protected would not die. As they rode away from the burning ranch, Rachel glanced back one last time. Against the night sky, the flames illuminated a solitary figure. Watching from the ridge, a man on horseback, silhouetted against the stars. Even at this distance, she recognized Victor Hammond's distinctive profile. Her grip tightened on the reins. Another name to add to those who would answer for her father's death. The old mining shaft loomed black against the starlit sky, its weathered timbers and rusted equipment standing like skeletal sentinels on the north ridge. Rachel and Silas approached cautiously alert for signs that Reynolds's men might have anticipated this destination. "Wait here," Silas instructed, dismounting stiffly. His face was a mask of bruises in the moonlight, but determination had overridden his physical pain. "Keep watch. If you see anyone approaching, don't wait for me. Ride for Judge Grant's ranch on the East Valley." Rachel nodded, though privately she had no intention of abandoning her uncle if danger appeared. She watched as Silas disappeared into the mine entrance, the darkness swallowing him completely. The minutes stretched endlessly. Rachel strained her ears for any sound besides the soft nickering of the horses and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Her father's journal was secure inside her coat, pressed against her heart like a talisman. A twig snapped in the forest behind her. Rachel turned sharply, her hand moving to the pistol Silas had insisted she carry. The moonlight created confusing patterns of light and shadow among the trees, making it difficult to distinguish movement from the natural swaying of branches. Another sound, the unmistakable crunch of a boot on frozen ground. "Who's there?" she called, drawing the pistol with a steadier hand than she'd expected. "Show yourself." Silence answered her. Then, gradually, a figure emerged from the tree line. Tall, well-dressed, despite the hour, with a bearing that spoke of confidence and authority. "Hello, Rachel," said Victor Hammond, stepping into the moonlight. "I thought I might find you here." Rachel kept the pistol trained on him, her finger resting lightly on the trigger as her father had taught her. "Stay where you are, Mr. Hammond. I know what your father did at Whitlow Creek. I know you sent Reynolds to kill my father." Hammond raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. "You've been misinformed, young lady. I didn't send Reynolds to kill Joseph. I've been trying to stop him." "Liar!" Rachel's voice shook with fury. "I saw you watching the cabin burn. You were there." "Yes, I was there," Hammond acknowledged calmly, "following Reynolds and his men as I've been doing since they arrived in Pine Ridge. I would have intervened sooner, but I was outnumbered." Rachel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Why should I believe anything you say?" "Because," Hammond replied quietly, "Joseph Thornhill saved my life at Whitlow Creek. And because I've spent the last 20 years trying to bring my father to justice for what he did there." The unexpected statement caused Rachel to falter momentarily. "What?" "I was a lieutenant in my father's regiment," Hammond explained, keeping his hands visible. "I witnessed what happened at Whitlow Creek. The slaughter. The cover-up. When I protested, my own father ordered me executed alongside the civilians." His voice grew softer. "Your father and uncle intervened. They smuggled me out with the children they rescued, gave me a new identity, a chance to build a different life." Rachel's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. "If that's true, why have you been trying to buy our ranch? Why threaten us?" "I never threatened you, Rachel. I offered to buy the ranch to protect you." Hammond took a careful step forward. "I've known for months that Reynolds was hunting down the last witnesses from Whitlow Creek. When I learned he'd traced Joseph to Pine Ridge, I came immediately, but I was too late." "Convenient," Rachel said, though doubt had begun to creep into her certainty. "Look at the journal," Hammond suggested. "Joseph would have recorded everything about that night, including who he saved." Rachel hesitated, then, keeping the pistol aimed at Hammond, used her free hand to withdraw the journal from inside her coat. Without taking her eyes off Hammond, she flipped to the entry for Whitlow Creek and scanned the pages by moonlight. There it was, a mention of young Lieutenant H., rescued alongside 3 children and given papers to establish a new identity in Montana Territory. Joseph had noted the lieutenant's courage in standing against his own father, even at the risk of his life. "You could have read this before," Rachel said, still suspicious. "When you searched our cabin." "I've never been inside your home, Rachel," Hammond replied patiently. "Ask your uncle if you don't believe me. He knows the truth." As if summoned by the mention, Silas emerged from the mine entrance, carrying a small metal box. He froze at the sight of Hammond, his posture instantly defensive, despite his injuries. "Victor," he acknowledged cautiously. "Sullivan," Hammond nodded in return. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Silas replied. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing you are," Hammond said. "Trying to finish what Joseph started. Trying to bring the men responsible for Whitlow Creek to justice, including my father." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You expect us to believe that—" "I saved your life tonight," Hammond countered. "I fired the shots that distracted Reynolds's men as they were preparing to burn the cabin. Without that diversion, they would have checked the barn and found your niece." Rachel glanced at Silas, looking for confirmation. After a moment of tense silence, he gave a reluctant nod. "There were shots," he admitted. "Just before the fire was set. Reynolds's men were spooked enough to leave quickly instead of being thorough." His gaze remained suspicious. "That doesn't prove your intentions." Hammond sighed. "I understand your distrust, but we're running out of time. Reynolds has telegraphed my father by now. More men will be becoming professional killers with government credentials. We need to get that evidence to someone who can use it effectively." "Judge Grant," Rachel suggested, lowering her pistol slightly. "Grant can't help us," Hammond replied grimly. "He's my father's man." Has been for years. This revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. But he's a federal judge, appointed through my father's influence, Hammond explained. The judge has built his career on my father's patronage. Then who? Silas demanded. Who can we trust? There's a federal marshal in Helena named Theodore Parker, Hammond said. He's been building a case against my father and his associates for years, investigating corruption in the territorial government. The evidence Joseph collected could finally give him what he needs for indictments. Rachel and Silas exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Despite everything, they had begun to function as a family unit, each reading the other's thoughts with growing accuracy. Helena is 3 days' ride, Silas pointed out. Through open country, Reynolds will have men watching the trails. I have a proposition, Hammond said. My ranch is a half-day's ride from here. We can rest there, tend to your injuries, and plan our journey to Helena properly. I have men I trust absolutely who can provide escort. Or it could be a trap, Silas countered. Hammond spread his hands. If I wanted you dead, I could have let Reynolds finish the job tonight. Instead, I'm offering the only real chance you have to survive long enough to deliver that evidence. Rachel studied Hammond's face, searching for deception, but finding only earnest resolve. She thought of her father's teachings about forgiveness and second chances, about his belief that truth would eventually prevail. We'll go with you, she decided, ignoring Silas's look of surprise. But if this is a trap, Mr. Hammond, I'll shoot you myself. Hammond's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. Your father would be proud of that spirit, Rachel Thornhill. He gestured toward their horses. We should move quickly. Dawn isn't far off, and we're exposed here. As they prepared to depart, Rachel cast one last glance toward the distant glow on the horizon, the remains of her childhood home still burning against the night sky. A strange calm had settled over her, a sense of destiny unfolding along paths her father had laid years before she was born. The truth about Whitlow Creek had claimed many lives over 2 decades. It had torn apart her family, separated brother from sister, uncle from niece. It had orphaned her twice over, first taking her mother in childbirth, then her father to an assassin's bullets. But perhaps, she thought, as they rode into the darkness, that same truth might yet restore what remained of her family, might yet bring justice for all those who had been lost along the way. The wooden horse her father had carved rested safely in her saddlebag, a tangible reminder of love that had endured beyond death, beyond betrayal, beyond time itself. As if sensing her thoughts, Silas rode closer, his presence steady despite his injuries. Your father always said truth was like water, he offered quietly. It might be dammed up for a while, but eventually it finds its way through. Rachel nodded, drawing strength from the simple wisdom. Then, let's help it flow, Uncle Silas. Together, the orphaned girl, the prodigal uncle, and the son who had turned against his father's crimes, they rode toward an uncertain dawn, carrying with them the evidence of atrocities long buried and the hope for justice long delayed. Behind them, the ashes of the Thornhill Ranch settled into the frozen ground, the fire of destruction having run its course. But ahead, another kind of fire burned, the unquenchable flame of truth that Joseph Thornhill had protected with his life, now carried forward by his daughter and the brother-in-law, who had returned too late to save him, but perhaps just in time to save his legacy. The Hammond Ranch sprawled across a valley nestled between pine-covered hills, its size and sophistication a stark contrast to the modest Thornhill property. A 2-story main house, constructed of hand-hewn logs and local stone, dominated the landscape, surrounded by bunkhouses, barns, and corrals that spoke of considerable wealth and careful planning. Dawn had broken by the time they arrived, the rising sun casting long shadows across frost-covered pastures. Rachel, exhausted from the night's ordeal, swayed slightly in her saddle. Beside her, Silas rode with the rigid posture of a man pushing through significant pain, his face pale beneath the bruises inflicted by Reynolds's men. Victor Hammond led them directly to the main house, bypassing the curious stares of ranch hands already beginning their day's work. A man of Hammond's standing, traveling with a battered mountain man and a young girl before breakfast, was bound to raise questions, but no one dared voice them aloud. "Mrs. Hollister," Hammond called as they entered the warmth of the house. A matronly woman appeared from what Rachel presumed was the kitchen, her expression shifting from welcoming to concerned at the sight of their disheveled state. "Mr. Hammond, what on earth—" "Prepare the east guest rooms," Hammond interrupted, "and bring hot water bandages and my medicinal kit." He gestured toward Silas. "This man needs tending." "Right away, sir." Mrs. Hollister hurried off, casting one last curious glance at the unexpected guests. Hammond led them to a spacious sitting room where a fire already blazed in a stone hearth large enough to roast an ox. "Sit," he instructed. "Mrs. Hollister will bring food shortly. You're safe here, at least for the moment." Rachel sank gratefully into a leather armchair, the warmth and comfort almost overwhelming after the night's terror and bitter cold. Silas remained standing, however, his posture alert despite his obvious exhaustion. "No one is safe as long as Reynolds is hunting us," he said. "Your men may be loyal, Hammond, but money loosens tongues." "My men know nothing beyond the fact that you're my guests," Hammond replied evenly. "Only Mrs. Hollister is aware of your identities, and she's been with my household for 15 years. Her discretion is absolute." Rachel studied the room while the men spoke, noting the quality of the furnishings and the numerous books lining shelves along one wall. This was the home of a cultured man, not merely a wealthy one. Her gaze settled on a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a much younger Victor Hammond in uniform standing beside another officer whose features unmistakably marked him as the current Senator Hammond. "That was taken before Shiloh," Hammond said, noticing her attention. "Before Whitlow Creek. Before I understood what my father was truly capable of." "He's your father," Rachel said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. "How could you not know?" Hammond's expression darkened with old pain. "We see what we wish to see in those we love, Rachel. My father was a hero to me, a model of duty and honor. It took watching him order the execution of women and children to finally understand the monster behind the medals." Mrs. Hollister returned with a young maid, both carrying trays laden with food, medical supplies, and steaming water. Once they had arranged everything and departed, Silas finally allowed himself to sit grimacing as his battered body protested the movement. "Let me help," Rachel said, moving to examine his injuries. The lamplight revealed the full extent of Reynolds's handiwork. Silas's face was a mosaic of purpling bruises, his lip split, one eye swollen, nearly shut. When he removed his shirt, at Rachel's insistence, she had to suppress a gasp at the darkening bruises across his ribs. With gentle hands that belied her youth, Rachel began cleaning his wounds just as she'd done for her father whenever he'd been injured working the ranch. Silas submitted to her ministrations with stoic silence, though she could sense his discomfort at being tended by his niece. "Your ribs might be broken," she observed, noticing his shallow breathing. "Just bruised," Silas replied. "I know the difference." Hammond approached with a glass containing amber liquid. "Whiskey, for the pain." Silas hesitated only briefly before accepting the offering. He drained it in one swallow, the only indication of his discomfort, a slight tightening around his eyes. "You should eat," Hammond suggested to Rachel. "Then rest. We have preparations to make before we can leave for Helena." Rachel shook her head. Not until I understand everything. She turned to Silas. You knew about Victor's past, didn't you? That's why you weren't surprised when he said Papa saved him. Silas nodded slowly. I recognized him in town that first day, though he's changed considerably since Whitlow Creek. I wasn't certain of his intentions. Why didn't you tell me? For the same reason Joseph didn't, to protect you from knowledge that might put you in danger. Silas winced as Rachel applied antiseptic to a particularly deep cut. The fewer people who knew Victor Hammond was once Lieutenant Victor Harrison of the 104th Regiment, the safer he remained. And the safer you remained, Hammond added. If my father ever discovered I survived Whitlow Creek, that Joseph and Silas had helped me escape, it would have signed your death warrants years ago. Rachel absorbed this information, fitting it into the complex puzzle of her family's history. So you've been working against your father all these years? Hammond moved to a writing desk in the corner and unlocked a drawer with a key from his pocket. Since the day I watched him order the slaughter of innocents, yes. He withdrew a thick folder of papers. I've spent 20 years gathering evidence of my father's crimes, not just Whitlow Creek, but the corruption that followed his rise to political power. Bribery, extortion, even murder when it suited his ambitions. Why haven't you exposed him before now? Silas asked. Hammond's expression hardened. Without corroborating evidence and witnesses, it would have been my word against a decorated war hero and respected senator. I needed proof beyond my own testimony. He patted the metal box Silas had recovered from the mine. Joseph's documentation may finally provide that proof. Rachel finished bandaging Silas's ribs and helped him into a clean shirt provided by Hammond. The simple domestic act seemed to bridge something between them, uncle and niece, finding their roles with each other after years of separation. You should rest now, she told Silas, her tone brooking no argument. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's battered face. You sound like Martha when you take that tone. The comparison startled Rachel, but she felt a warm glow at this connection to the mother she'd never known. Was she bossy too? She preferred determined, Silas replied, his eyes softening with memory, and she was usually right. Hammond cleared his throat. Mrs. Hollister will show you both to your rooms. We'll meet again this afternoon to plan our journey to Helena. Rachel hesitated. The evidence will be locked in my personal safe, Hammond assured her, along with what I've gathered myself. No one can access it without my knowledge. Despite her exhaustion, Rachel slept fitfully in the comfortable guest room. The events of the previous night kept replaying in her mind, the attack, the fire, the destruction of her home, and everything she'd known. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames consuming her father's possessions, erasing the physical reminders of his existence. Around midday, she gave up on sleep, and dressed in clothes Mrs. Hollister had provided, simple but well-made, clearly belonging to a girl somewhat older and larger than herself. She made her way downstairs, following the sound of voices to Hammond's study. The door stood partially open, allowing her to see Hammond and Silas bent over a map spread across a large desk. Silas looked marginally better after a few hours' rest, though his movements remained careful and measured. The main road is too obvious, Hammond was saying, tracing a route with his finger. Reynolds will have men watching it. We'll need to take the old mining trails through the high country. Difficult terrain, especially with the girl, Silas observed. I can ride as well as either of you, Rachel announced, pushing the door open fully. Both men looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. And I've earned the right to be part of this planning. Hammond recovered first, inclining his head in acknowledgement. Of course, Rachel. Please join us." She approached the desk, studying the map they'd been examining. "This is our best route to Helena." "The safest, though not the easiest," Hammond confirmed. 3 days through rough country, but less chance of ambush." He indicated several marked locations. "I have supplies cached along the way, provisions, fresh horses if needed." "You've planned for this?" Rachel observed. "For years," Hammond admitted. "I always knew this day might come." Silas pointed to a spot on the map marked with a small cross. "What's this?" "A hunting cabin belonging to a friend. We can rest there on the second night." Hammond straightened, wincing slightly at some hidden pain. "We'll leave at dusk. Traveling at night for the first leg of the journey reduces our chances of being spotted." Rachel nodded, finding comfort in the concrete details of the plan. "How many men will accompany us?" "None," Hammond replied. "More riders mean more visibility, more noise, more chance of detection. Just the 3 of us." Before Rachel could respond, the study door burst open. Mrs. Hollister stood in the doorway, her normally composed face tight with alarm. "Riders approaching from the east, Mr. Hammond. 6 men heavily armed." Hammond moved to the window, carefully positioning himself to see without being seen. His expression darkened. "Reynolds, with 5 others." He turned to Silas and Rachel, his voice suddenly urgent. "There's no time to reach the horses. They'll have the house surrounded within minutes." "A trap after all?" Silas asked, his hand moving to the pistol at his waist. "No," Hammond replied firmly. "If I'd betrayed you, I wouldn't be warning you now." He crossed to a bookshelf and pulled a specific volume, revealing a hidden mechanism that caused a section of the wall to swing inward. "This passage leads to an underground cellar with access to the creek bed. Follow it north for half a mile and you'll reach the old stables. There are horses there. Wait for darkness, then head for the hunting cabin on the map." "What about you?" Rachel asked. "I'll delay them claim I haven't seen you." Silas shook his head. "They'll kill you once they realize you've helped us." "Perhaps," Hammond smiled grimly. "But my father's men hesitate to murder a Hammond on Hammond land. It creates uncomfortable questions." He pressed a folded map into Rachel's hands. "The route is marked. If I don't join you by midnight, continue to Helena without me. Marshal Parker will know what to do with the evidence." Rachel clutched the wooden horse that hadn't left her possession since the night before. "Victor, thank you." "So go," Hammond urged, already closing the secret door behind them. "And Rachel, your father would be proud of the woman you're becoming." The hidden passage plunged them into near darkness, lit only by narrow shafts of light filtering through concealed ventilation holes. Rachel led the way, her smaller frame navigating the tight confines more easily than Silas, with his injured ribs. The passage sloped downward, the air growing increasingly damp and cold as they descended beneath the ranch house. "Hammond risking his life for us," Silas muttered as they hurried along. "Never thought I'd see the day." "People change," Rachel replied, thinking of how her own perceptions had shifted so dramatically in recent days. The man she'd feared as her father's killer was now the uncle she trusted with her life. The neighbor who'd seemed to threaten their ranch was actually an ally in their fight for justice. The passage eventually opened into a low-ceilinged cellar carved from the earth and reinforced with timber supports. Crates of provisions and weapons lined the walls, Hammond's emergency supplies for the escape route he'd planned so carefully. "He's been preparing for this moment for years," Rachel observed, examining a rack of rifles and boxes of ammunition. "Men haunted by the past often prepare for its return," Silas replied, selecting a rifle and checking its action with practiced hands. "Take only what we can carry easily. Food, ammunition, medical supplies." As they gathered what they needed, muffled sounds from above suggested that Reynolds and his men had reached the house. Rachel paused, straining to hear, but the earth and timber muffled any words exchanged. "Do you think they'll believe him?" she asked. "That he hasn't seen us?" "Reynolds isn't a fool," Silas replied grimly. "But Hammond is a respected man in these parts. His word carries weight." He handed Rachel a small revolver. "Keep this close. Use it only if absolutely necessary." They continued through another passage that gradually sloped upward, eventually emerging into a dry creek bed, sheltered by overhanging trees and brush. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows across their path as they made their way northward, keeping to the creek bed to avoid leaving tracks. True to Hammond's directions, they reached the old stables after half an hour's careful travel. The weathered building stood partially hidden by a copse of pine trees, far enough from the main ranch that it was unlikely to be searched immediately. Inside, they found 3 horses already saddled and waiting, along with additional supplies strapped to the saddles. Hammond had planned for every contingency, anticipating their needs with remarkable foresight. "We wait until dark," Silas decided, checking the horse's tack. "Less chance of being spotted leaving the property." Rachel nodded, sinking onto a hay bale, the exhaustion she'd been fighting finally catching up to her. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt her eyelids growing heavy. "Sleep," Silas said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch." She wanted to protest, to insist that he needed rest more than she did with his injuries, but her body betrayed her. Within moments, she drifted into an uneasy slumber, filled with dreams of fire and pursuit. Rachel woke to Silas's hand gently shaking her shoulder. Night had fallen, and the stable was dark except for a single lantern burning low. "Time to go," he said softly. "I've heard riders passing nearby. They're searching the property." Fully alert now, Rachel rose and gathered her things. The metal box containing her father's evidence was securely strapped to her saddle, along with the supplies they'd collected from Hammond's cellar. "Any sign of Victor?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "Nothing. We need to assume he's been detained, or worse." The night air bit with midwinter cold as they led the horses from the stable. Stars blazed overhead in a cloudless sky, the moon a thin crescent providing minimal light, good for concealment, but challenging for travel through unfamiliar territory. They mounted and set off at a careful pace, following the route marked on Hammond's map. Silas led his military experience and years in the wilderness, making him a natural pathfinder even in darkness. Rachel followed close behind, alert for any signs of pursuit. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they left Hammond's property, climbing into the foothills that would eventually lead to the high mountain passes. Pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings, the trail narrowing until they were forced to ride single file along precipitous ledges. "How did you survive up here?" Rachel asked during a brief rest to water the horses at a half-frozen stream. "All those years in the mountains?" Silas considered the question, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "One day at a time," he replied finally. "The mountains don't care about your past or your regrets. They only care if you're smart enough and tough enough to survive them." He glanced at her, a hint of pride in his voice. "You would have done well in the high country. You have good instincts." "Papa taught me to be self-reliant," Rachel said. "He always said that out here being able to take care of yourself was the difference between life and death." "Joseph was a wise man." Silas tightened the cinch on his saddle, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his injured ribs. "He raised you well, Rachel. Better than I could have." The simple acknowledgement touched Rachel deeply. There was no jealousy in Silas's words, only recognition of her father's accomplishment in raising her alone. They continued through the night, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or check their bearings against Hammond's map. By dawn, they had covered impressive ground, reaching a high plateau that offered a view of the valley they'd left behind. "We should rest during daylight," Silas decided, guiding them toward a sheltered ravine where a small stream provided water. Travel again after dusk. They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted by pursuers. Rachel shared jerky and hard bread from their supplies, watching Silas check and recheck their weapons with methodical care. "Do you think they're following us?" she asked. "Almost certainly," Silas replied, not sugarcoating the reality. "Reynolds isn't a man who gives up easily, but we have a good head start, and Hammond's route keeps us away from the obvious trails." Rachel huddled deeper into the coat Mrs. Hollister had provided. "What happens when we reach Helena? If Marshal Parker believes our evidence, what then?" "Justice, I hope." Silas looked at her thoughtfully. "Though justice means different things to different people. For some, it's seeing the guilty punished. For others, it's simply having the truth acknowledged." "What kind do you want?" Silas was silent for a long moment, his weathered face contemplative in the early morning light. 20 years ago, I would have said punishment. An eye for an eye." He sighed. "Now, I think I'd settle for the truth being known. For Joseph's sacrifice to mean something." Rachel nodded, understanding. "And afterward, when it's over," the question seemed to catch Silas off guard. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For 13 years I've lived day to day, not allowing myself to consider a future beyond survival." "You could come back to the ranch," Rachel suggested tentatively. "Help me rebuild. It's what Papa would have wanted." Something flickered in Silas's eyes, hope perhaps, or the fear of hoping. "The ranch is gone, Rachel, burned to the ground." "The buildings are gone," she corrected. "The land remains, our land." She met his gaze steadily. "Family land." Before Silas could respond, the distant but unmistakable sound of a gunshot echoed across the plateau. Both froze, listening intently. Another shot followed, then several in quick succession. "That's not hunting fire," Silas said, already moving toward the horses. "Someone's engaged in a firefight due west of us. Reynolds's men, possibly, or Hammond if he managed to follow us." Silas helped Rachel into her saddle, his movements urgent but controlled. "Either way, we need to move. Now." They set off at a faster pace than was strictly safe on the rocky terrain, angling northeast to put more distance between themselves and the gunfire. The horses, sensing their riders' tension, moved with nervous energy despite their fatigue. As they crested a rise, Silas suddenly reined in, raising a hand for Rachel to halt. Ahead, where the trail descended toward a narrow pass, 4 riders had appeared, moving directly toward them. "Back," Silas whispered urgently. Slowly. They retreated behind the ridgeline, dismounting to lower their profile. Silas led the horses to a cluster of pine trees, tethering them out of sight. "Stay with the horses," he instructed Rachel. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, follow the map to the hunting cabin. Don't wait for me." "I'm not leaving you," Rachel protested. "This isn't a debate." Silas checked his rifle. "Those men are between us and our destination. I need to know if they're Reynolds's men or just travelers." Before Rachel could argue further, he moved away, keeping low and using the terrain for cover as he worked his way back toward the ridge. She watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned to the horses, stroking their necks to keep them calm and quiet. Minutes stretched painfully. Rachel counted them in her head, each passing moment increasing her anxiety. When she reached 8 minutes with no sign of Silas's return, She began preparing to follow him despite his instructions. Then she heard it, a single gunshot followed by the unmistakable sound of a body falling among rocks. "Uncle Silas," she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Fighting panic, Rachel forced herself to think clearly. If Silas had been killed or captured, Reynolds's men would be searching for her next. She needed to move to find a more defensible position or a better hiding place. Leading the horses deeper into the trees, she searched for options. The forest grew denser to the east, offering better concealment but slower travel. To the north lay more exposed terrain, but potentially faster escape if she could reach the next line of hills. A twig snapped behind her. Rachel whirled, drawing the revolver Silas had given her. "Stop right there," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's me," came Silas's voice from the shadows. He emerged slowly, hands slightly raised to show he presented no threat. "Easy with that pistol." Relief flooded through Rachel, so intense she nearly dropped the weapon. "I heard a shot. I thought—" "One of them spotted me," Silas explained. "I had to create a diversion." He approached, taking the reins from her trembling hands. "They're Reynolds's men, all right. 4 of them, well-armed, searching in a pattern. They must have split up from the main group. What do we do? Change course." Silas consulted Hammond's map. "There's another route marked here, more difficult terrain, but less likely to be watched. It adds half a day to our journey, but better than riding into an ambush." They mounted again, now heading due east through increasingly dense forest. The going was slow, branches slapping at their faces and legs as they picked their way through underbrush and across rocky streams. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the search party, but at the cost of significant detour from their planned route. The horses were tiring, and Rachel could see that Silas was in pain, though he made no complaint. "We need to rest," she insisted when they reached a small clearing beside a frozen pond. Silas didn't argue, which told Rachel more about his condition than any admission would have. He dismounted stiffly, one hand pressed against his bandaged ribs. "Just a short stop," he conceded. "We're still too exposed here." Rachel helped him settle against a fallen log, then tended to the horses, removing their bits so they could drink from a spot where she broke the ice covering the pond. As she worked, she kept glancing back at Silas, noting the pallor beneath his weathered tan and the tight lines of pain around his mouth. "Let me check your ribs," she said when she'd finished with the horses. "They're fine." "You're a terrible liar, Uncle Silas." The familial term slipped out naturally now, no longer awkward or forced. "Please, let me help." Reluctantly, Silas allowed her to examine his bandages. When she unwrapped them, she had to suppress a gasp. The bruising had darkened significantly, spreading across his torso in vivid purples and blacks. "These aren't just bruised," she said accusingly. "They're broken." "Cracked, maybe," Silas admitted. "Nothing to be done about it except binding them tight." Rachel rewrapped the bandages, making them firmer than before. "You should have told me you were injured this badly. We could have traveled more slowly." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Silas replied. "Reynolds won't stop hunting us until he recovers that evidence or ensures we can never deliver it." As if the mere mention of their pursuer had summoned trouble, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees. Both froze, listening intently. "They've picked up our trail," Silas said grimly, struggling to his feet. "We need to move." "You need rest," Rachel protested. "I'll rest when we're safe." Silas checked his rifle, his expression hardening with resolve. "Or when I'm dead. Until then, we keep moving." They mounted quickly, abandoning any pretense of caution in favor of speed. Silas led them on a winding course through the forest, occasionally doubling back, or crossing streams to confuse their trail. The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. "There," Silas said, suddenly pointing ahead, "the hunting cabin Hammond marked on the map." The structure was barely visible among the trees, a small log cabin built against a rocky hillside, its roof covered with enough pine needles and forest debris that it blended almost perfectly with the surroundings. No smoke rose from its chimney, no light showed in its single window. They approached cautiously, Silas dismounting to investigate, while Rachel remained with the horses, rifle ready. After a tense minute, he signaled that all was clear. The cabin's interior was simple, but well-maintained. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Most importantly, it offered solid walls and a defensible position if Reynolds's men managed to track them this far. "We'll stay here tonight," Silas decided, securing the door behind them. Set out before dawn for the final push to Helena. Rachel busied herself preparing a meager meal from their supplies, while Silas tended to the horses, concealing them in a small lean-to behind the cabin. By the time he returned, she had a fire going in the fireplace, its warmth beginning to take the edge off the cabin's bone-deep chill. They ate in companionable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. The events of the past days, the revelations about their family, the attack on the ranch, the desperate flight through mountain wilderness, seemed to have forged a bond between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. "You should take the cot," Silas said when they'd finished eating. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest more than I do," Rachel countered. "I'll take first watch, wake you in a few hours." Silas looked as though he might argue, then seemed to recognize the determined set of her jaw, the same expression her mother had worn when her mind was made up. "2 hours," he conceded. "Then you wake me. No heroics, Rachel. Promise me." "I promise," she agreed, settling herself in a chair positioned to view both the door and the single window. "Now rest." Despite his obvious exhaustion, Silas took time to check his weapons one last time before stretching out on the narrow cot. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Rachel watched him in the firelight, studying the face that had become so familiar in such a short time. The harsh lines of the mountain man were softened in sleep, revealing glimpses of the younger Silas who had once been her mother's beloved brother, her father's trusted friend. How different might her life have been if pride and jealousy hadn't driven him away, if he had been part of her childhood, a presence rather than an absence. The wooden horse her father had carved rested on the table before her. Rachel picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth contours, feeling the love and craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Her father had made this while waiting for her birth, a gift from a man who had never known his own daughter would face her mother's death and his own murder before receiving it. Yet here she sat, the wooden horse in her hands, her uncle sleeping nearby, a fragment of family salvaged from tragedy. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever awaited them in Helena, she had recovered a piece of her heritage that had been lost for 13 years. The night deepened around the cabin. Rachel maintained her vigil occasionally, adding wood to the fire, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate pursuers had tracked them to this hidden refuge. But only the normal noises of the forest reached her, the rustle of wind through pine branches, the occasional call of a night bird, the crackle of the fire. When 2 hours had passed, she hesitated, looking at Silas's sleeping form. He needed the rest desperately, his body requiring time to recover from both Reynolds's beating and the rigors of their flight. Surely another hour wouldn't hurt. Her decision was made for her when a soft but distinct sound came from outside, the snort of a horse that wasn't theirs. Rachel froze, listening intently. There it was again, followed by the unmistakable crunch of a boot on frozen ground. Someone was approaching the cabin. Moving silently, she woke Silas with a hand pressed gently but firmly over his mouth. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert, despite his interrupted sleep. She gestured toward the door, mouthing, "Someone's outside." Silas nodded, reaching for his rifle as he rose silently from the cot. He positioned himself beside the window, carefully peering through a gap in the rough curtain. A soft knock came at the door. Not the forceful pounding of someone intent on breaking in, but a measured, almost tentative sound. "Sullivan," came a voice from outside. "Rachel, it's Hammond." A relief flooded through Rachel, but Silas remained cautious, signaling her to stay back as he moved toward the door. "Prove it," he called softly. "Whitlow Creek," came the reply. "March 1863. You and Joseph smuggled me out with 3 children. You gave me the name Victor Hammond, papers your brother-in-law had prepared for emergencies." Silas relaxed marginally, though his rifle remained ready as he unbarred the door. It swung open to reveal Victor Hammond alone and unarmed, his expensive coat torn and bloodied along one sleeve. "You made it," Rachel breathed, moving forward to help Hammond inside. "Barely," Hammond replied, wincing as she took his arm. Reynolds wasn't convinced by my denials. His men searched the ranch thoroughly while he questioned me. A grim smile touched his lips. Rather insistently. "You're wounded," Silas observed, noting the blood on Hammond's sleeve. "Bullet grazed me during my escape," Hammond confirmed. "Nothing serious, but it made tracking you more challenging than I'd anticipated." He looked around the cabin with satisfaction. "I see you found the place without difficulty." "We had to take a detour," Rachel explained, guiding Hammond to a chair. "Reynolds's men were on the main trail." While Silas secured the door again, Rachel helped Hammond remove his coat to examine his wound. The bullet had indeed only grazed his upper arm, but the injury had bled significantly and looked painful. "How did you escape?" Silas asked, as Rachel cleaned and bandaged the wound. "Reynolds made the mistake of leaving only 2 men to guard me while he led the search for you." Hammond's expression darkened. They underestimated how much I'd learned about survival since Whitlow Creek. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Hammond had done what was necessary to free himself, just as he'd been doing what was necessary for 20 years in his quest for justice. "Did you encounter any of Reynolds's men on your way here?" Silas asked. Hammond shook his head. "They're scattered across the mountains, searching in a grid pattern. Most were headed west, following a false trail I laid before making my way here." He accepted a cup of coffee from Rachel with a nod of thanks. "But they'll regroup by morning. We should leave before first light." Rachel sat across from the 2 men, suddenly struck by the strange fellowship they represented, 3 survivors bound by shared history and common purpose. Hammond, the son who had turned against his father's crimes. Silas, the brother-in-law, who had returned to honor a deathbed promise, and herself, an orphaned girl carrying her father's legacy of truth. "How far to Helena from here?" she asked. "A day's hard ride," Hammond replied. "We'll reach Marshall Parker by nightfall tomorrow, if we push the horses and avoid any further encounters with Reynolds's men." "And then," Rachel pressed. Hammond and Silas exchanged glances, the weight of 20 years' secrecy and planning passing between them. "Then," Hammond said quietly, "we bring down a senator, several high-ranking military officers, and a network of corruption that reaches into the territorial government itself." His gaze shifted to the metal box containing Joseph's evidence. "Your father's documentation, combined with what I've gathered over the years, will ensure indictments that not even my father's influence can prevent." "There will be a price," Silas warned. "Men like Senator Hammond don't fall without striking back." "I've been prepared to pay that price for 20 years," Hammond replied. "Have you?" Silas looked at Rachel, concern evident in his expression. "It's not just our lives at stake now." Rachel straightened, drawing strength from the legacy her father had entrusted to her. "Papa believed truth was worth dying for," she said simply. "I won't dishonor that belief by hiding from it now." A look of approval crossed Hammond's face. "Joseph would be proud of your courage, Rachel." "It's settled then," Silas said, though worry still creased his brow. "We leave for Helena before dawn." They took turns keeping watch through the remainder of the night, allowing each a few hours of precious rest before the journey ahead. Rachel slept fitfully, her dreams a confused jumble of burning cabins, pursuing riders, and her father's voice calling instructions she couldn't quite hear. She woke to Silas's gentle touch on her shoulder, the cabin still dark except for the dying embers of the fire. Hammond was already preparing the horses, his wounded arm clearly paining him, but not slowing his efficient movements. They departed in the gray half-light before dawn, the world around them still and silent, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves. The final leg of their journey would take them out of the high country and down toward the territorial capital, leaving the relative safety of wilderness for the more exposed approaches to civilization. The day passed in a blur of vigilant travel. They avoided main trails, kept to cover when possible, and maintained a grueling pace that tested both riders and mounts. By mid-afternoon, they could see Helena in the distance, its buildings tiny against the backdrop of mountains. "We're going to make it," Rachel said, hope rising in her chest for the first time in days. "Don't celebrate yet," Silas cautioned. "The approach to the city is where we're most vulnerable. Reynolds will have men watching the roads." Hammond nodded in agreement. "We'll circle around, enter through the mining district on the east Petard, less likely to be observed there." As they descended from the foothills, the terrain gradually opened before them, rolling plains interspersed with patches of forest and scattered homesteads. The horses, sensing the end of their journey, moved with renewed energy despite their fatigue. They were crossing a small stream when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up water inches from Hammond's horse. Before any of them could react, more shots followed, coming from a copse of trees to their right. "Ambush!" Silas shouted, already wheeling his horse toward the nearest cover, a rocky outcropping 20 yards away. "Ride!" Rachel urged her horse forward, bent low over its neck as bullets whizzed overhead. She reached the rocks just behind Silas, both of them dismounting and drawing their weapons in one fluid motion. Hammond was only seconds behind, blood streaming from a fresh wound on his cheek where a bullet had grazed him. "Reynolds?" Rachel asked, peering carefully around the edge of the rocks. "And at least 4 others," Hammond confirmed, wiping blood from his face. "They must have guessed our destination and positioned themselves accordingly." Another volley of shots struck the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying. Their position offered temporary shelter, but little in the way of escape routes. Behind them lay open ground for several hundred yards. Attempting to flee across it would be suicide. "We need to hold them off until dark," Silas decided, returning fire with careful precision. "Then try to slip past them to the city." "Helena's less than 5 miles away," Hammond said. "If one of us could break through, reach Marshal Parker—" "Too risky," Silas cut him off. "We stay together." The firefight continued, sporadic exchanges that accomplished little except to maintain the stalemate. Reynolds seemed content to wait them out, knowing time favored his position. He had men, ammunition, and the strategic advantage. As the afternoon waned, Rachel noticed Silas's breathing becoming increasingly labored, his face pale with pain and exertion. The ride had taken its toll on his injured ribs, and now the stress of combat was pushing him to his limits. "Uncle Silas," she whispered, "you need to rest." "No time for that," he replied grimly, though he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands as he reloaded his rifle. Hammond had been studying the terrain with a tactician's eye. "There's a drainage culvert about 50 yards to our left," he said quietly. "Runs under that rise. Might offer a way out of this killing zone." "Too exposed," Silas argued. "They'd cut us down before we reached it." "Not with covering fire." Hammond checked his ammunition. "I can give you enough time to make it if I stay here. Keep their heads down." Rachel stared at him. "That's suicide." A sad smile touched Hammond's lips. "Perhaps, or perhaps it's the purpose I've been working toward all these years." He looked at the metal box secured to Rachel's saddle. "That evidence represents Joseph's sacrifice and the lives of everyone who died at Whitlow Creek. It needs to reach Marshall Parker, whatever the cost." "There has to be another way," Rachel insisted. "There isn't." Hammond's tone was final. "And you know it." Silas studied Hammond's face, seeing the resolve there. "You're sure about this, Victor?" "I've been living on borrowed time for 20 years, Hammond replied simply. "Time Joseph and you purchased for me at Whitlow Creek. It seems fitting I should repay that debt now." Rachel felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back. This was not a moment for a child's emotions, but for a woman's understanding of sacrifice and duty. "When darkness falls," Hammond continued checking his weapons one last time, "I'll create a diversion, something to draw their fire and attention. When you hear it, run for the culvert. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Just go." "Victor," Rachel said softly, "thank you for everything." Hammond reached out briefly, squeezing her hand. "Your father saved my life, Rachel. He gave me the chance to become something more than my father's son. If this is how that journey ends, I can face it without regret." They waited as the sun sank toward the horizon, the shadows lengthening across the rocky ground between their position and the drainage culvert Hammond had identified. Occasionally a shot would ring out from Reynolds's men, a reminder that they remained vigilant, waiting for their quarry to make a desperate move. Darkness came swiftly in the Montana winter. As the last light faded from the sky, Hammond prepared his diversion, a bundle of cartridges wrapped in oilcloth, with a slow, burning fuse, improvised from cord soaked in gun oil. "Remember," he said, as he prepared to move to a new position that would draw attention away from their escape route, "don't stop for anything. Get to Helena, find Marshall Parker. The evidence speaks for itself." Silas gripped Hammond's shoulder in a warrior's farewell. "We'll make it count, Victor. I swear it." "I know you will." Hammond turned to Rachel, his expression softening. "Your parents would be proud of the woman you've become, Rachel Thornhill. Never doubt that." Before she could respond, Hammond was gone, moving silently through the darkness to a position 20 yards away. Minutes later, a bright flash and series of explosions erupted from that direction, followed by a barrage of rifle fire from Hammond that made it sound as though several men were attacking Reynolds's position. "Now!" Silas urged, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her toward the culvert. They ran half-crouched across the open ground. Behind them, the gunfire intensified as Reynolds's men focused their attention on Hammond's position. They reached the culvert, a narrow passage barely large enough for an adult to crawl through, just as shouts indicated the ambushers had realized the diversion. "Go first," Silas instructed, pushing Rachel toward the opening. "I'll follow." Rachel hesitated only a moment before dropping to her hands and knees and crawling into the darkness of the culvert. Cold water soaked her clothing as she moved through the narrow space, emerging on the other side to find herself in a shallow ravine that offered cover from Reynolds's position. Silas followed seconds later, his breathing ragged with pain and exertion. "Keep moving," he gasped, "toward the city lights." They half ran, half stumbled through the darkness, following the ravine, until it widened into a creek bed that led toward Helena. Behind them, the gunfire had diminished to occasional shots, a fact Rachel tried not to interpret. The outskirts of the city appeared before them, scattered buildings, giving way to more established streets as they approached the mining district Hammond had mentioned. By the time they reached the first proper street, both were exhausted beyond measure, Silas barely able to remain upright. "The marshal's office," he managed between painful breaths. "Western side of town. Government building." They attracted curious stares as they made their way through Helena's streets, a battered man supporting himself against a young girl, both filthy, blood-stained, and clearly exhausted. But no one interfered, the frontier city having seen its share of desperate arrivals. The territorial marshal's office occupied the ground floor of a solid brick building, flying the United States flag. Despite the late-hour lights burned in the windows suggesting that Marshal Parker or his deputies were still at work. Rachel helped Silas up the steps and through the door. Inside, a single deputy looked up from paperwork, his expression shifting rapidly from annoyance to concern at the sight of them. "We need to see Marshal Parker," Rachel said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Immediately. It's a matter of life and death." "The marshal's not available at this hour," the deputy began, but Silas cut him off. "Tell him it's about Whitlow Creek," he said, "and Senator Hammond." The deputy hesitated only briefly before disappearing into a back office. Moments later, he returned with a tall, broad-shouldered man whose weathered face and watchful eyes marked him as someone who had seen his share of frontier justice. "I'm Theodore Parker," he said, studying them with careful assessment. "And you are Rachel Thornhill," she replied, "daughter of Joseph Thornhill, and this is my uncle Silas Sullivan." Something flickered in Parker's eyes at the name's recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of long-held suspicions. "Come into my office," he said, holding the door open. "Deputy, make sure we're not disturbed." The marshal's office was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. Maps covered one wall, wanted posters another. A heavy safe stood in one corner, while a desk piled with documents dominated the center of the room. "You mentioned Whitlow Creek," Parker said once they were seated, his tone carefully neutral. "And Senator Hammond." "We have evidence," Rachel said, removing the metal box from her satchel and placing it on the desk. "Documentation of what really happened there, and of other crimes committed by the senator and his associates." Parker's expression remained professional, but a new intensity entered his gaze. "I've been investigating rumors about Whitlow Creek for almost a decade," he said quietly, "but witnesses have a habit of disappearing. Evidence becomes mysteriously lost." "Not this evidence," Silas said. "Joseph Thornhill documented everything. Witness statements, orders, names, dates. He kept it hidden all these years, knowing someday it would be needed." "Joseph Thornhill," Parker repeated. "Your father." He looked at Rachel. "Yes, he was murdered 3 weeks ago by a man named Malcolm Reynolds, working on Senator Hammond's orders." Parker's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation against a powerful man." "The evidence supports it," Rachel replied steadily, "along with many others." Parker unlocked the box, examining its contents with methodical care. As he read through Joseph's documentation, his expression grew increasingly grave. "This is comprehensive," he said finally. "More than comprehensive. It's damning." "There's more," Silas added. Victor Hammond, the senator's son, has been gathering evidence against his father for years. He helped us escape Reynolds's men, gave us the route to reach you. Victor Hammond. Parker looked up sharply. The cattle baron. He's involved in this. He was at Whitlow Creek, Rachel explained. A lieutenant who refused to participate in the massacre. My father and uncle helped him escape, gave him a new identity. Where is he now? Rachel and Silas exchanged pained glances. He stayed behind, Rachel said softly. Created a diversion so we could escape Reynolds's ambush outside the city. Parker absorbed this information with a grim nod. I'll send men to look for him, but if Reynolds was involved, he left the implication unspoken. In the meantime, you'll both stay here under my protection. These documents will need to be authenticated statements taken, preparations made for what comes next. What does come next? Rachel asked. Justice, Parker replied simply. Though it may not look the way you expect, men like Senator Hammond have resources connections. This won't be quick or easy. Will it be worth it? Silas asked the question that had haunted him for 20 years, finally given voice. Parker looked at Joseph's documentation again, then at Rachel and Silas, living embodiments of the cost of truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. Yes, he said finally, it will be worth it. Your father's courage won't have been in vain. 18 months later, Rachel Thornhill stood on the hilltop cemetery behind the rebuilt Thornhill Ranch house. Spring had come early to Montana that year, carpeting the valley in wildflowers and fresh green growth. Before her stood 3 wooden crosses, her parents' graves, flanking a newer one bearing the name Victor Hammond, Friend and Hero. They had found his body the morning after their arrival in Helena, riddled with bullets, but surrounded by evidence he had fought to his last breath. He was buried here on Thornhill land at Rachel's insistence. It seemed fitting somehow that the man who had helped deliver justice for Whitlow Creek should rest near the family who had once saved his life. The trials had concluded 2 months earlier. Senator Thaddeus Hammond, convicted of multiple counts of murder, corruption, and obstruction of justice, would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison. Several high-ranking military officers and territorial officials had joined him, their careers and reputations destroyed by the evidence Joseph Thornhill had preserved and Victor Hammond had supplemented. Malcolm Reynolds had never stood trial. He had been found dead in a Denver hotel room, apparently the victim of his employer's desire to eliminate loose ends once their own arrests became inevitable. I thought I might find you here, came Silas's voice from behind her. Rachel turned to see her uncle approaching, looking remarkably different from the wild mountain man who had stood in chains at her father's funeral. His beard was neatly trimmed now, his clothes those of a respectable rancher rather than a wilderness hermit. The past 18 months had aged him. In some ways, the trials had been grueling, the public scrutiny intense, but had also restored something of the man he had been before pride and jealousy had driven him from his family. Just saying goodbye, Rachel explained, gesturing toward the graves. Letting them know we're finally going to Helena tomorrow. Silas nodded, understanding. The journey to Helena held significance beyond the practical it represented, Rachel's first step toward the education her father had always wanted for her. Marshall Parker had arranged a place for her at a prestigious school there, funded by the government's substantial reward for the evidence that had exposed the Whitlow Creek conspiracy. Your father would be proud, Silas said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Your mother, too. Do you think so? Rachel asked, a hint of the 12-year-old girl she had been still audible beneath the young woman's voice. Sometimes I wonder if they'd recognize the person I've become. They'd recognize your courage, Silas assured her, your determination to see justice done no matter the cost. Those are qualities you inherited from both of them. Rachel smiled, touching the wooden horse that never left her possession. And my stubbornness? Where did that come from? A soft laugh escaped Silas. That my dear niece is pure Sullivan. Martha had it in spades, and I'm afraid you got a double portion. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The rebuilt ranch house below them was smaller than the original, but sturdy, a testament to the community that had rallied around Rachel once the full story of her father's murder and her family's ordeal became known. "Will you be all right here alone?" Rachel asked. They had discussed this many times, but she couldn't help worrying about leaving her uncle to manage the ranch while she was away at school. "I won't be alone," Silas reminded her. "Dr. Owens checks in regularly, and I've hired good men to help with the cattle." He gave her a reassuring smile. "Besides, Helena isn't the moon. You'll be back for holidays and summer. And when I finish school," Rachel added firmly, "this will always be home." Silas nodded, his expression softening. "Your father built something special here. Not just a ranch, but a legacy of truth and integrity. That's something worth preserving." Rachel looked at the 3 graves once more, then turned toward the house that represented her future. "Truth, like water," she said softly, remembering Silas's words from their desperate flight through the mountains. "It finds its way through." "That it does," Silas agreed, accompanying her down the hill toward home. "And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, it also finds its way back." As they reached the porch, Rachel paused, looking back at the hilltop cemetery one last time. The setting sun illuminated the crosses with golden light, transforming them from symbols of loss to markers of lives well lived and sacrifices honored. "We found our way back too, didn't we?" she asked. "You and I." Silas followed her gaze, understanding the deeper meaning of her question. "Yes," he said simply. "We found our way home." Inside the ranch house, Rachel had prepared a special dinner to mark their last evening before the journey to Helena. The wooden horse her father had carved held pride of place on the mantel, alongside the photograph of her parents' wedding, with Silas standing beside them, no longer damaged, but carefully restored and properly framed. As twilight settled over the Thornhill Ranch, Rachel realized that while the past 18 months had brought justice for Whitlow Creek and her father's murder, they had delivered something even more precious, the family she'd never known she had, and the future her parents had always wanted for her. The journey ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities, perhaps even new trials. But she would face them with the strength she'd inherited from her father, the determination that had been her mother's gift, and the resilience that marked her as her uncle's niece. Truth had indeed found its way through, just as Joseph Thornhill had believed it would. And in doing so, it had transformed 3 broken lives: a grieving daughter, a guilt-ridden brother, and a son who had turned against his father's crimes into something that resembled, against all odds, a family.